Hey, Marby, I think everyone's picture disappeared on the side, but maybe that's typical. I just wanted to point that out before we start.
Okay.
And I also no longer have access to like the Q&A and that bar.
Okay, we'll monitor it for you. And you can start whenever you're ready.
Great. Well, thank you for attending and calling in on this, for those on the West Coast, very early hour, and going across the country. I know we're bringing in several time zones here. So my name is Angie, and I'll introduce myself at the end of the panelists. And so first, before I get started, just a reminder that there's a Q&A button at the bottom probably of your screen that allows you to ask questions. So please do ask questions. We're happy to answer them as we go through. And Marby, again, I don't have any of the buttons or anything, or anyone's picture on my screen. So if there's anything you can do to fix that, that would be great. And before we launch into sort of the topics we're going to cover, I'd like to introduce each of the panelists. What initiated this discussion is I joined UCLA about 3 years ago and was very impressed with sort of the creative models that UCLA was using and wanted to share those. And I know Bryce quite well, and their reputation at University of Michigan. And my boss, Amir Nyberg, is aware of Natalia's success and said, you need to get her on this roundtable as well. So I'll start with Natalia, if you want to introduce yourself and explain your institution, how you fit in.
Thank you so much, Angie. So I'm a technology transfer manager at the Technology Transfer Office of École Polytechnique Fédérale de Lausanne, which is a technical school and university in the city of Lausanne in Switzerland. My activities in tech transfer are full-time devoted since almost 20 years now, mainly in life sciences. My background is a researcher. I made a postdoc with Novartis project, so already a step in the tech transfer during my academic life. I had some private activities for consulting for investors in the biotech area, and I joined the tech transfer of EPFL at the time a new life science faculty was created in 2002. I'm also in the committee, in the steering committee of the Swiss Association of Technology Transfer, so the kind of equivalent of AUTM in the USA. Thank you, Angie, for inviting me.
Great, and I'm just having a technical glitch here, so just bear with me. I was supposed to show slides of your institution, and it's locking me out. I had it all set up and working before we started. The only thing that makes me feel any better is that this sometimes happens to CNN. So
no worries.
I'm just trying to figure out why my slides won't click on. So Marby, I don't know what happened when you hit record, but that's when it changed for me. And everyone can see each other's pictures. I'm sorry to kind of interrupt us, but like.
Yes, we see the panelists.
Okay, I'm going to try to share again, but it's not letting me.
You can see it now, Angie.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and you can see that change?
Yes, we do.
It looks odd. And it's taking up the whole screen? Sorry. It's filling up the whole screen because it's not on for me.
Yes, it is.
It is.
Okay. So it'll just look odd for me. That's good. So just to go back to Natalia, I wanted to show some of your stats and kind of explain, if you want to just give a little bit on your slides here, just to show the audience just what your success has been today.
So in matter of, so if you see the previous slides, perhaps just one previous, or just the slide before, or let's move on the innovation part. Some highlights which are for 2019 that are pretty similar over the last years. We manage, okay. So the EPFL is made of a bit more than 10,000 students, a bit more than 2,000 PhD students. It has almost 350 faculty members and a staff of above 6,000 people, including the PhDs, who are structured in 5 schools: life sciences, basic sciences, informatics, engineering, and architecture. Many 20 institutes, subdivisions in those 5 schools, research centers, which are associations of labs on specific thematics also outside our institution, and 371 research laboratories. So if we move to the next slide, with regard to technology transfer activities, we create about a certain number of spin-off per year. It's an average. It goes between 15 and 20 every year. Last year we went perhaps a little bit above. We raised almost 300 million venture capital in Swiss francs in 2019, and we filed almost 100 patents, priority applications. Also noticeable, we ranked in the top 100 university in the USPT grants last year. So yeah, that's for EPFL.
Great. And then I'll move to Bryce.
Great. Well, thanks for having me, Angie, and thanks to the other panelists. Like a lot of panels, you learn so much in the pre-panel prep discussions that it's well worth the time just to learn from what other institutions are doing. So I'm Bryce Pilz. I'm Director of Licensing at the University of Michigan's Tech Transfer Office. And how we handle sponsored research agreements at U of M is that the Office of Research and Sponsored Programs, run by Craig Reynolds, who probably several people on the phone call know, handles the sponsored research agreements from start to finish. Although if there's going to be any deviation from our standard IP terms, the agreement gets kicked to my team to handle the negotiation of those IP terms. And I think it's probably a majority of cases for an industry-sponsored research agreement where there's going to be some negotiation over the IP terms. So last year we were involved in negotiating over 120 industry-sponsored research agreements, and that would be the number where there was some deviation from our standard IP terms. You know, we're a large public research university. Last year we had $1.6 billion of research expenditures. You can see that the graph here at the upper left, that probably like a lot of your schools, the federal research expenditures have stayed relatively steady. And so there's been an emphasis on trying to grow other sources of funding, whether it's industry, foundations, or internal. So last fiscal year, we had $118 million of industry-sponsored research. You know, several of those are pretty significant industry partnerships through master research agreements. And then on the tech transfer side, where we get the joy of handling the great output from all this research, these are unofficial numbers for this last fiscal year that just closed. But we had 522 inventions that came to us, 31 new startups created, and 274 commercialization agreements. And probably like a lot of other schools, you know, there's more and more startup activity, and there's a lot of reasons behind this. But there is definitely a tension, or at least some complexity involved between startups and industry-sponsored research. You know, and just one example here at Michigan, where we have a lot of sponsored research from the automotive sector, and there used to never be any startups in the automotive sector. Obviously, that's all changed in the last 5 years because almost every engineering faculty member, you know, has some ideas for an autonomous vehicle or delivery or electric vehicle startup. And that can, you know, create issues when you start to look at the background IP clauses in these big master research agreements. And we can talk more about that in a bit. My personal background is I'm a recovering attorney, started at a big firm in Chicago, and then joined Michigan, the general counsel's office, spent some time at the law school starting our entrepreneurship programs, and then 4 years ago had the opportunity to join the tech transfer office in my current role.
Great. And now I'll move to Ragan. And there is a delay with my slide switching too, so I apologize.
No worries, thanks. So I'm Ragan. My title is Business Development Officer and Information System Officer at UCLA. I've been within the tech transfer industry for I guess about 15 years now, almost in almost every single type of role that's there, be it a licensing officer or all the way down to a tech fellow or even part of the support teams, depending on where you're at. I've been at UCLA for now almost 8 years, and I've been in this role dealing with the licensing side of things for I think 4. Time flies when you're having fun. So UCLA is, our office is set up such that it has the licensing side as well as the sponsored research side for the for-profit entities under the same umbrella. We all report up to the same individual. In our case, it's Amir Nyberg. Angi's on the licensing side just as I am. And I guess some of my background has just been, I was a PhD student at Columbia, then I went into starting being an intern at the tech transfer office there, and have continued to be in some role or one another in tech transfer for the past 15 years. It's been really impressive to see the changes that we have tried to implement at UCLA over the past 4 years to try to improve how our office connects with industry and builds our relationships with industry. And one of those ways is this concept of how do we kind of merge together or blend together the sponsored research agreements with and continuing development with our background IP and the IP that's developed by our fantastic faculty members.
Great, thanks. Hi, I'm Angi Kujak. I've been at UCLA for 3 years. Prior to that, I spent 7 years at Wharf, and then 5 years out of law school, I was a patent attorney at a private law firm. And I have a lot of interest. I think Bryce raises a really excellent point that the ecosystem continues to be really inundated with startup activity, which is just presents a different dynamic with sponsored research. And I think there's a lot of synergy or benefits that can come into play with startups and industry-sponsored research, both for the startup side as well as the university. And so we'll kind of step through those different issues that arise, and then how the universities have found creative ways to get around these issues or to address them. And can everyone see the topics slide? I apologize, I just can't tell. Great. So just a reminder again, please ask questions along the bar. You'll see a quick Q&A button, so just feel free to submit questions. We're going to start out with background IP, go to pre-negotiating royalty terms and other terms, talk about what we refer to as bundling, licenses and sponsored research, and then finally follow up with assignment and indirect costs. So to start it out, the background IP, it's a notorious term that we often hear come up in the negotiator side, like it's always an ask and a challenge as the beginning of a relationship with a for-profit. So Bryce, can you tell me a little bit about your experience when this issue arises, what you tend to do to address this issue and the concern on the industry-sponsored side?
Sure. So, when we talk about background IP, we're generally talking about IP that's created outside of the scope of the currently contemplated research project. IP that arises from that project we normally call foreground. And the big concern that we have at Michigan is whenever the sponsor tries to get some sort of rights to institution-wide background IP. And this is where there's a huge difference between an industry-industry partnership and an industry-academic partnership. And the reason why most academic institutions have so much heartburn over industry-wide background IP is that while we may be one legal entity in name, and that legal entity for us, the Regents, the University of Michigan, may technically own all the IP, in reality, we are a very loosely connected, highly distributed independent labs. And it is almost impossible for us to agree to license Professor B's intellectual property because it may become background IP to Professor A's foreground IP. And the reasons why that's so hard for us is number one, most universities have an unwritten rule or policy that we won't license intellectual property under which researcher invented it without that researcher knowing about it or at least agreeing to it. Again, while the university may technically own the IP, the faculty have a large amount of control and say and information rights in our licensing practices. There's also some legal problems, as we'll talk about in a bit. There's an old case, the Singer case, that causes problems for a university if you ever trade potential licensing revenue for sponsored research. And that would, in effect, be what's happening in that Professor A, Professor B example, where you're licensing, perhaps for free, Professor B's intellectual property in exchange for sponsored research that goes into Professor A's lab. And so those are things that we just can't do. And so therefore, it's very hard for us to agree to any future rights in institution-wide background IP. So in almost all cases, we really try to contain the discussion to background IP arising from the PI's lab, who's going to perform under that sponsored research agreement. A couple other issues that often come up is quite often the sponsor will say, okay, well, don't agree to automatically license the institution-wide background IP, but can you at least agree to perform a commercially reasonable search and tell us about anything that could be relevant? And that's difficult too. When you talk about, performing effectively an institution-wide freedom to operate search over pending applications, it's one of those things that sounds very benign to someone, that doesn't have a background in patent law, but to anyone that understands like patent law and reading claims and different words that are used and the fact that provisional applications may not have claims and aren't publicly available, it just makes your head spin. And so that's something that, only in rare cases have we ever even gone down that road. And those are usually for major master research agreements and partnerships. And we'll set forth, a very kind of prescribed framework, for searching for certain keywords and describing inventions that we may have, containing those keywords. Otherwise, it's almost impossible for a big research school to understand what's pending in terms of patent applications. And then the other issue that seems to come up more and more is what we call sideground IP or future background IP, where the sponsor doesn't just want to know institution-wide IP that predates the commencement of the research project, but they want to know related IP that may arise in the future outside the scope of the sponsored research project. And that brings all the same problems I just talked about, but even more because you don't even know what it is yet. So, again, we're pretty comfortable handling any arrangement for background IP as long as it's contained to the PI's lab. We can, because then it's very easy to talk to the PI, for us to search, for us to figure out what background IP exists. And if it's available, we can make the business decision to license it, to option it, to however the sponsor wants to bundle it, because we know what we're getting into and the PI knows what they're getting into in that case.
Thanks, Bryce. And the reason I bring this one up is, like, I imagine the audience is thinking, what's that creative solution you're going to provide me that solves and makes it go away? I think there is value in sharing that every institution sort of faces this challenge. And I used to write opinions, freedom to operate opinions, and I would be given 5 distinct patents, and a product that already exists. Here, we're asking for someone to hypothetically think about what could come out of the research, and then what out of all of the huge patent portfolio, thousands of patents and patent applications, whether there's anything that reads on it in a way that the industry member might want to practice that hypothetical invention. So I really appreciate hearing just that the struggles are at every university. It's not that we don't want to enable that to happen. It's just the task of undertaking that effort. And Ragan, I know we deal with this a lot. Maybe you can share some of the things that we've done to try to help appease the industry sponsor.
Yeah, so a lot of times, honestly, though, when we have like the background IP, it just turns into, this is what we know that exists, and this is the patent application that we were aware of because we've been told by our office, we've been told, the faculty member has told us. And then it gets into the concerns about like, oh, well, if you're so concerned about this background IP and it being gone and going somewhere else, why don't you go ahead and take an option to it or go ahead and license it while you're doing the sponsored research agreement? And that actually seems to solve the problem frequently. You know, and from the perspective of putting it into an option agreement, it can actually be pretty straightforward and pretty simple and pretty inexpensive for a sponsored researcher or the entity that's performing the sponsored research. So that seems to be one of the easiest solutions that has recently come around when I'm having to deal with the background IP, especially within the therapeutic side of things.
Yeah, and the PI has so much knowledge. It's like they are the experts and they really know kind of what's out there. Sometimes just having that relationship between the industry, that's one of the big advantages, I guess, of sponsored research, is that industry can have that direct line of communication with the PI to get a sense of what's out there. And Natalia, did you want to add anything on this one?
I think my colleagues covered pretty much the situations that we have also naturally here at our institution, and the way to tackle them are pretty similar. We would confine to the same PI, to the same group. We would possibly identify, I mean, if there is identified IP that would ease the path towards an option, if the partner is interested. We would not, and I can remember of being forced by an external party to really open up background IP to all institution or on something that is not identified. Sometimes there is a kind of agreement on the best efforts if such background IP is identified after the beginning of the relation, that we are in a good phase, provided we're free and there is no strings attached to add a negotiation up on that. And if there is an option, then that's also a pretty easy solution and for us, absolutely.
Great. So then launching into sponsored research agreements themselves, I think one issue that comes up a lot is the unpredictability when we extend an option. They'll often say, you know, an option's great that we can negotiate, but I really don't want to invest the time and money right now if later there's going to be a great unknown of what terms are going to apply to those future inventions. And so one solution that often comes up is pre-negotiating those terms. Some universities are able to do that and willing to do that. I know in my prior experience at another institution, we were very reluctant. Here at UCLA, we are much more open to that and to find creative solutions to bring and assure the industry member sponsor that we aren't going to just hold them over a barrel and just not agree to anything that's reasonable at the time of negotiation. If you could tell me a little bit about how you deal with pre-negotiation of terms, why that might be an issue and what you have to consider when you do that. And that was directed to Natalia.
Of course, we are open to do that. I think perhaps it happens a bit more often when the external partner asks for it, but we could be triggered by a situation where we have a strong background IP that we want to take advantage of, pushing towards the market through that way as well. And we are open to pre-negotiate terms. They are usually non-binding, so they are kind of annexed to the collaboration relation, and we try to limit that to really important particular principle of clauses, but more practically on the financial terms. If it can reinsure the external partner, we are happy and open to do that if we can come up with reasonably justifiable figures at that time.
And then Ragan, did you want to add yet?
Sure. So we're at UCLA, we've begun to look at that more and more frequently, as in providing some sort of clarity on what would be the quote unquote cost to the industry partner on any IP that would potentially come out, or even bundling the IP, the background IP in the foreground if that situation is appropriate. I think the biggest problem or the biggest key is being able to truly define what that IP is that is expected. When I'm dealing with the life science side of things, my space is within the small oncology and the gene therapy. It's a little bit more clear about what is going to potentially be the invention that comes out of it. And so being explicit in what that definition is, or what we as a group, as in the company as well as the university, what we can agree to, as in what would we expect the invention to be, can really help resolve those concerns and worries about what it is. The issue will always be if there's something that comes out of it that we're not sure, or that didn't fit within the scope of what the work or what we initially thought it was. And by being explicit upfront about what the invention, what we think the invention is, really does help allay a lot of those fears. I surmise that within the physical science space, it might be a little bit more difficult given the technologies that come out of the research, or the research in general there. It might be a little bit more difficult to perform that kind of analysis.
Yeah, I know in our offline conversations on this topic and the other topics that we'll discuss, a lot comes down to how much you can monitor, how much nuance you can bring to the analysis. So I just put a slide together that provides some of the things to consider that I know I've kind of learned and gone through and discovered, like, oh, this issue has arisen, how will I fix it for next time? So as Ragan alluded, often in the physical sciences space, it's unpredictable what's going to come out of their research, but also how it'll be applied. So, you know, if you throw out the example in my last bullet about solar panels, you know, we all know that we're working on solar panels. What will that royalty rate be? Well, what is it that we're actually selling? You know, in one circumstance, I know we had a situation that had an energy technology, not solar panels, but an energy technology where everyone thought we were going to sell the widget itself, you know, the solar panel. But it turned out that it was actually going to be the energy that was going to be produced by that panel. So the more you can be specific, and I tried to provide an example here, you know, the royalty rate for all inventions will be 2%. Maybe consider the royalty rate for inventions related to solar energy will be 2%, or even more specific, those that are sold in the form of a solar panel, so that you can really drill it down. You know, or is it services? Sometimes we get stuck with a term sheet or something that had been negotiated, and we were left with, well, what was the intent of the parties at that time? What did they have in mind as far as what that product was for sale? So that's just one of the things to consider when you're pre-negotiating terms, really drilling it in as narrowly as possible. But of course, providing more and more assurance, flushing that out in advance with your industry sponsors so that there are no surprises on the other side when, you know, there's a disagreement where we thought everyone was on board with and had in mind, you know, we were going to sell a widget, and on the other side, it's like, well, we thought that applied to services. So just the more specific you can be and nuanced, you tend to have a more positive industry relationship in the end. And Bryce, did you want to add anything on this?
Yeah, I mean, we will quite often pre-negotiate terms, and you know, we're actually, you know, taking a close look at how we do things and thinking of changing things a bit, because right now, you know, we will customize each deal, and it's probably the worst of both worlds for us right now, because, you know, we will listen to a sponsor and be willing to pre-negotiate and basically bend over backwards to come to whatever IP term arrangement works for them. But by doing that, you put them through negotiation, because what we call flexibility and customization, they call pain and negotiation. And we probably arrive at, you know, like the worst possible scenario economically for the university in terms of IP. You know, I really like what some schools have done in terms of laying out kind of a framework for different economic models for future IP. You know, Minnesota, because we're so close to them, you know, geographically, we're well aware of what they've done. And I really think that seems to work, where there's kind of option A, option B, option C of different, you know, frameworks for pre-negotiated terms. And, you know, while you're losing flexibility, you're gaining efficiency and transparency, and in many cases, the terms that they're proposing out front are better than the terms we're arriving at through negotiation. So, you know, I kind of like, you break out exclusive licenses, which, you know, on the physical science side, I mean, there's very few exclusive licenses, you know, and especially in a sponsored research context, normally when a big tech company is coming to you, they've got all the background IP. need, they've got exclusivity, if not through market power, through other IP. And so all they want is access to this IP. And so they're only looking at that non-exclusive license term. So quite often they'll be saying, but we're paying for it, why shouldn't we have the right to use it? And they want a commercial, non-exclusive, royalty-free license to come from that. And they'll say, like, say whatever you want about the exclusive terms. And that's where, you know, over the last few years, we've been granting a whole bunch of free commercial, non-exclusive, royalty-free licenses. And when we talk to the sponsor, you know, they'd be willing to pay more in indirects. They'd be willing to pay some pre-negotiate up front, as long as they know what it is and they don't feel like we're pulling it out of a bag arbitrarily. And so I like the idea of what people call a technology fee, which is, hey, pay 15%, whatever, 10% of the project budget up front, and you have a royalty-free, non-exclusive license to whatever comes out. Normally, when they take that license, you know, you'll look at the amount they pay, and it's probably a below market rate for most paid up non-exclusive licenses. But they're paying it up front, so they may pay it, and there's no IP that ever comes up. So they're making a bet. And if you look at those deals over the course of several years, at least for other schools that have done this, it starts to make economic sense, and the sponsors love it because, you know, they don't feel like they're haggling in order to get access to IP that they feel like they're paying for, even though, as we'll talk about in a bit, they're not really paying for the IP, they're just paying for their work. And then on the exclusive side, if someone wants to set a royalty in advance, outside of the case of therapeutics, in every other case, we're perfectly fine doing that because, again, outside of therapeutics, if you get a royalty, you're probably well achieving, if not overachieving. And so, you know, normally we're fine in discussing a preset royalty on those terms.
Yeah, we're looking at a very similar thing at UCLA as far as looking at which portfolios or tech spaces tend to produce more licenses and those that we don't successfully license, and then how much time are we spending. And it does seem often that the biggest and most intensive negotiations tend to fall in those same spaces where we don't do a lot of licensing successfully anyway. So can we save some time there by coming up with potential models? I think, you know, I kind of want to have a part 2 to this where we dive into some potential models. You know, here I think we're going to cover a lot of the basics like background IP. You know, next we'll move to bundling, and I'll have Ragan explain that. I think a cloud that kind of hovers around sponsored research and licensing, and what gets everyone nervous on the university side is this Singer case. And I'm just going to briefly cover that case just to explain what it was. And now that I'm at University of California, that's where it arose from. I had some conversations with those that were around at that time to kind of get a sense of what happened. So first I should preface like everything, like Bryce and I were saying, we can't find this case, where is it? Well, that's because it's unpublished and you can't even cite it as support anyway. So I think we should put that into context as far as, you know, of course it has some good themes and some concepts that arise out of it, but, you know, the underlying opinion itself really can't be used to support a position anyway. But so I think that was a surprising thing on my part, is to discover that it's not a published opinion. But like Stanford v. Roche, which went all the way to the Supreme Court, yes, that's one that should grab our attention. But nonetheless, I'll kind of talk about the themes that happens there and practice tips. So Singer was at UC Berkeley for 25 years, and he also had an appointment at UCSF and collaborated with a lot of researchers there. He was foundational in the MRI space, so he was credited in a Nobel laureate speech to saying that he laid the foundation for the work of the Nobel Prize winner. So he had a bunch of MRI technology along with another researcher named Lawrence Crook from UCSF. And they were, at the time, the way UC was structured, there was one person handling the licensing on behalf of all of the campuses. And so they were negotiating royalties to these, this set of background IP, we'll call it. And they had started negotiating at around a 5 or 6% royalty. And there was good evidence that they were about to agree to that in an option. So it was a pre-negotiated term that was going to apply under an option. Well, things kind of delayed. The option never got executed, and eventually it resulted in an exclusive license for a royalty rate of 0.56, so a dramatic reduction in the royalty rate. At the same time, the university was also negotiating a very large industry-sponsored research relationship with a couple companies, one in particular, 20 million over the course of much time. And put two and two together, there were allegations from the researchers that, hey, wait a second, I didn't get a lot of that money that came in under sponsored research. What happened here? This isn't fair. You know, are you trading a lower royalty on my IP, which affects their inventor share, in exchange for getting in more sponsored research? Ultimately, it started out at the trial court where the University of California won, supporting their position, saying, no, these were independently negotiated. They had lots of evidence too that one wasn't a trade for the other. The IP was in its early infancy and needed a lot of research, and that's what really drove down the royalty rate. But nonetheless, the researchers appealed, and they won at the appellate court level. And there were a few things that, you know, really that the court centered in on, which are great practice tips to consider. The same way, we consider Stanford v. Roche when we do our negotiations. They had a whereas clause that linked the two and said, you know, we're also negotiating this other agreement, and, you know, that's very important to the overall relationship. A real takeaway from that, the linking of the two, is to be very clear that when you negotiate, and Ragan, again, we'll launch into bundling, we'll call bundling agreements, is to be very careful about making one conditional on the other. So saying things like, oh, if you ever stop sponsoring research, we have the right to terminate the license. From the court's perspective, and I think a lot of us could think about that and say, yeah, that might not seem like the best thing to do, to consider that, just to make sure that there truly are independently living agreements. Also, the royalty rate here, I think that was the big issue for them, really. So the fact that it went from 5 to 0.56, and it just happened to correlate it to the researchers were able to prove that the amount of money that came in would have brought it back up to this percentage. So they really did feel like it was a trade-off, and were able to demonstrate that. And the last thing is just to consider, when you do have these dual negotiations going on, that you are in communication, but also considering the scope of researchers under the SRA versus the scope of inventors for the background IP that might be being licensed. So I'll just stop there. Just think, those were the principles. Primarily, just be aware, be awake when you are doing bundling, to make sure that later you don't have a lot of upset researchers and inventors saying that unfair consideration was being pushed to the sponsored research side of things. And I prepared a slide for Ragan just to help guide. So go ahead, Ragan.
Sure. So when I'm dealing with the bundling agreements, you know, there are obviously quite a few traps that are out there that, you know, we'll get into. I wanted to really focus on the positives first, right? So from the perspective of the faculty member, you know, a lot of times what they're looking at is that this is their baby, their project is their baby, and they want to see it move on and get, you know, further developed and move on and be further, you know, made to something. See it make an impact in the economy, make an impact in society. And so that can be dependent on if it's money or if it's just helping the society, but nonetheless, see it move forward, see it move off the bench. And so a lot of times, sometimes the faculty are constrained to prevent that, or that they can't be involved with the company to be able to help move that technology forward or develop that technology due to the policies of the university. And sometimes it's just their own interest. They were academic researchers. They're not working for companies and those kinds of things. So we have this concept of trying to kind of put the two together, right? And now, not necessarily as a single contract or single contractual vehicle, but as two distinct things that have distinct parts of them that are important. So like dealing with the sponsored research, it's self-contained, it's this specific thing, and with this specific scope of work, specifics budget and all of those. And the idea is that the IP that would be developed out of there is, again, go back to what I said on the earlier question, that it's highly defined. When you have a situation where things can be, the invention can be highly defined, or at least highly defined between the parties themselves are able to say, we expect the invention to be X, or we expect the invention to be Y. And when you have those situations, and you also have, say, background IP, especially the patent rights for background IP that's relatively similar or related to this highly defined potential invention, it can help put those things together to allow for the invention that may further be developed and or be created, that's, again, highly defined, can then be rolled back into the license agreement under the same financial terms that were in that license agreement. And again, you're negotiating the license agreement with the intent or with the understanding or belief that, sure, the IP that's going to be developed here, again, is this well-defined bit of IP. There's a lot of benefits that companies get out of this. Again, one of the primary benefits is cost. So the future cost to the company in regards to the IP, because they have it understood that this specific type of IP will be rolled into the license automatically. But also they get certain aspects, especially that's extremely beneficial for startups. So those early phases, those early initial points where there's no employees, or there's only 2 employees of a company, but they still want to get that technology moving forward and developed. Well, there's the world's expert sitting right there at the university that obviously wants to help, and a lot of times wants to see this be as successful as the regents do, or as the university does, or as the company does. And so providing that opportunity to the actual researcher to continue to do the work, to continue to provide that expertise, but as under the auspices of their academic appointment, as then their intellectual contributions into their curiosity, allows for them to continue to have kind of like a hands-on in their baby, or to help their baby grow up to be at least a toddler. And then to the university, you know, it's a big deal because there's always the concept of this IP being leaked out the back door, right? Where it's, you know, some IP is licensed, and then the company develops new IP, and then it moves on with the developed IP. And so that sometimes that's a good thing, because we're trying to improve those companies or trying to build up the economy or the ecosystems. But a lot of times, you know, it feels like, well, we kind of got, you know, this end around kind of idea for from the company. So by kind of trying to sync these things together allows us to make that a little bit easier on the regents or the university and the administration and the inventors themselves, so that we don't feel like we got that someone else went away from us on there. And to be quite honest, dollars today is actually worth more than dollars tomorrow. There's, you know, a cash in hand is probably worth more to a lot of individuals than the potential of a royalty rate in 15 years from now, when we don't even know if that is going to be successful or not, or turn into a commercial product. So it really is imperative, going back to what Bryce was showing in his graph, where do we get money? We need more money for the universities. Our federal funding's flat, so what do we do? And this is one opportunity to help build up the dollars right away into the university.
Yeah, just to add on Ragan's, and then I'll move to Natalia. With the sponsored research, it's a big value, even with big companies. I've just noticed over time enough trends that it's those relationships, even among big pharma and big industry, where that relationship with the researcher lasts a little bit longer in the lab, where there's a little bit more research done, you know, where the company funds it and helps that transition from lab to industry, where the most success is. Where I found, like, where we've been in several situations where it maybe jumped too soon and the company struggles for a couple of years, loses patent life, or maybe then it would have been advantageous had the researcher help them shepherd it along through sponsored research. You get to preserve patent life. They get to preserve resources and hiring employees to try to do that work. And, you know, again, the world expert can help you further develop that technology much more quickly than someone who's brand new to it, who hasn't grown up with it. And Natalia, I know you do this quite a bit too. If you could share your expertise.
Absolutely, we are absolutely positive and open to have what I would call perhaps a coexistence of a license agreement towards the technology and a sponsored research agreement to develop that technology. And I think this is the reality. I mean, research is ahead, and when innovative research is ahead, we have typical situations where, for example, there is a new biological pathway or a new way to look at it and use it for finding therapeutics, for example. It might be very possible that even the university would almost be the only lab to be able to process that assay to further develop compounds or things like that. So we are, and there are many analog situations in other technological domains. So we are absolutely in favor to encourage that, to put in place the agreements that allows that. Of course, with the caution, as the Singer case reveals, that we must be careful to make them really as independent as possible in the kind of on the aspect of the financial consideration to avoid those problems. Now there is an influence of on the value, so that we can negotiate for sure, is that the value that the project the research project is getting to lead at will probably influence the royalty rate or the other considerations that we would be able to negotiate with in another theoretical situation. So yeah, I mean all the aspects that they were covered by Bryce, Ragan, and you, Angi, are totally relevant for us as well.
Great, and you know, moving to you a little bit more, Natalia. One thing, and I was curious to bring you into the conversation because we often hear from companies outside of the United States, we want assignment. We're used to getting assignment. Why can't you provide assignment? You must be holding something from us. And from a U.S. entities or institution perspective, we have the federal funding that's quite substantial at many of the major institutions. And so there's that obligation to provide a license back to the government. And I know you have prepared a couple slides. If you could just explain what those companies might be referring to.
Mm-hmm. So indeed that EPFL, historically, since the early ages of industrial collaborations, we have a model agreement where we allow the companies to file patent application in their own name and at their own costs on results of the projects they funded. Of course, in limited timelines to allow publication and as much as possible normal academic activity. And this is something that is quite successful. Many of a big percentage of our agreements are based on this kind of relation. So the idea is not to assign the ownership of the results in their entirety, but let the company be able to pick up the inventions they are interested in. And this also saves us a step to file ourselves and find a partner for finding a licensing. So this is we see this as an effective way to perform technology transfer directly in our sponsored research agreement relations. So in that slide, I just tried to cover a little bit all the different types of agreements, and of course, as Ragan said, money comes up front is something better one in now than two in the future. So this is also reflected in the overheads that we have, because what we call typically industrial grants or sponsored research agreements are do charge a less high overhead than those research agreements where the company has the right to file patent applications with charge with higher overhead at 40%. So if
oh, go ahead, keep going.
Yeah. So if we can perhaps see on the next slide a bit more specifically what those two types of relations we have. So for the industrial grants, which is more similar to your sponsored research agreements, we would remain entirely the owner of the results, and the company would benefit from an exclusive option time to trigger a license agreement. That license agreement can be triggered with pre-negotiated terms or not. Most of the time it's not pre-negotiated, but we are open to pre-negotiate terms. And and that kind of relation, as we said before, by commenting and explaining our approaches on background IP, can also eventually contain background IP if it's appropriate. That background IP certainly being from the same research group, of course. And if we move on to the next slide, we have this other model, which historically came from a time where EPFL and I think other institutions in Switzerland as well were not allowed to file patent applications in their own name. They didn't have the legal clearance to do that. And then came this legal clearance, which was kind of equivalent of the Bayh-Dole Act, if we want, for the USA. And there but we continued with this model, as I said before, for the reason that it's for us an effective way to perform technology transfer. So those relations can contain either the right to file patent application and commercially exploit, but most often, and especially if the value of the institution can be well explained or identified, we also get royalties from that exploitation later on. And also importantly, a back license on that IP the company would file to be allowed to pursue other activities, even with external partners, if we need to further develop in technology in other applications, for example. So this is quite a robust model that we use since decades now, and seems to work pretty well.
Yeah, and Bryce was referring to this during one of our conversations as well. And to his point too, that we spend a lot of time negotiating sometimes those agreements that perhaps where assignment may not be an issue. You know, maybe it would never be licensed anyway, and we end up going down this rabbit hole, trying to figure out how to make something work, only to discover that nothing results, and you know, no money comes in, and the research isn't performed. So there's always that delicate balance. And so I know at University of Michigan, you've noted this. We too trying to think of other creative ways to address this. And Bryce, do you want to talk at all about assignments and kind of how you've looked at those?
Sure. I mean, so the request comes up quite a bit, and I'd say probably 9 times out of 10 we're able to have a conversation with the sponsor and explain why this is not a work for hire arrangement, but instead sponsored research. Because if they're kind of ideologically approaching the situation as work for hire, probably the ownership of IP is the least of the problems you have in that agreement. You probably have indemnification flowing the wrong way. You have a bunch of other stuff that makes this look like hired gun, work for hire work, instead of what we see it as, contributing to research and being able to tap into the great minds that exist in academic labs. There are some situations where the sponsor is just entirely hung up on an assignment, and there, if we're comfortable there's no federal funding used, sometimes they're still willing to pay. They just need to feel like they own it, in which case we can normally make that work. And then sometimes, we say, hey, even though we don't totally align with the way you're thinking, like it's just not worth the time here to negotiate over this, and we'll agree to it. There have been a few cases where we've opted into assignment. It's kind of interesting. We've had these larger sponsored research arrangements where the sponsor is, totally hung up on controlling patent prosecution, and That's a rare thing for our general counsel's office to agree to. If they do, they normally say, okay, you can control, but your firm needs to agree to treat us like a client. And the sponsor come back and say, well, there isn't going to be a firm. We're going to prosecute this in-house because we have a large in-house IP group, so we can't treat you like a client. And we've almost like we come full circle, and our general counsel's office says, why don't we just assign it? Because then like it gets us out of, you know, all these, you know, risk allocation hangups that universities normally have by virtue of being a licensor. Like, let's just totally give it up. Like, we can still keep the same economics, which in this deal we thought were fair. You know, and once we assigned it, general counsel's office had no problem giving up patent control, not concerned about all the enforcement language that normally you're concerned about, because now you feel like when they enforce, you're not a necessary party. So it was kind of interesting, this thing that normally we resist. Like in this case, you know, it just made totally sense to give it up because everything else was fine. And by assigning, we alleviate all the concerns over patent control, enforcement, participation, all this other stuff that normally gives us heartburn.
Yeah, and at UCLA, you know, this comes up quite a bit as well, but also in the clinical trial space quite a bit. And, you know, who tends to be our biggest advocate is actually the researcher. So informed consent, you know, getting those informed consents in advance from those researchers to say, hey, just FYI, if we assign, they might enforce the patent and you'll have to, you know, be pulled into that litigation without our ability to control that for you. Also, your ability to continue research on your campus, on the campus in this space might be curtailed. You know, also trying to balance that, because sometimes the researchers themselves, like once they're informed as to what it really means, they'll come around. But to your point, like sometimes all of those issues are just non-existent. So it does seem like a solution that can be used. So one question that came up, moving to Q&A, is that, you know, how many times does a sponsor really agree to just a non-exclusive option when they fund research? And Ragan, I know you and I have worked on some interesting things at UCLA where multiple companies have actually funded a particular project and they all get to walk away with potentially non-exclusive rights. And I think that might be a growing model in the physical sciences space. I think there's a lot of companies that are interested in a particular space. They don't want to fund the entire thing because maybe it's a lot and they don't know, you know, they can de-risk by sharing that cost with other companies, knowing well that at most they'll walk away with a non-exclusive license. And I think we've all seen this with consortiums, with larger consortiums that get together on a particular research space. But Ragan, if you want to talk about that at all.
Yeah, I get the sense that a lot of those consortiums have essentially equated the non-exclusive royalty-free licenses that are embedded in those grants as basically their way of, you know, a freedom to operate, so that they can say that they have the right to continue to do what they want to do internally and develop their own products, and especially within the physical science space, it seems that way. I do find that it's a bit of a kind of like a downturn or a downside from the university's perspective, because it just closes some doors in the future of what we could potentially do in the future. As Bryce pointed out, you know, I don't think anybody really would have been able to foresee the explosion within the automotive industry 5 years ago for startups. And so, you know, it's the same kind of thing with these large consortium agreements. We can't really predict what's going to be, you know, hot or very interesting in 5 years, and you're kind of cutting your legs out from underneath you when it comes to it. But I think you kind of have to look at it as, you know, how much money is coming in now. You know, again, the dollars today are more valuable than the dollars tomorrow. And a lot of times the funding that's being done by these large consortiums, they're actually really close to being basic research, or, you know, one step into translational research. And that's actually very valuable for our academic mission and our research mission. And so the fundamentals and building the foundation, you know, the concept of all the scientists stand on the shoulders of giants, you know, that kind of thing. And that really you know, if that's where the money comes from, then, you know, that's where the money comes from. And so that can actually be, you know, it just had to be a little bit more cautious amongst each other, both the tech transfer office and the sponsored research office and the inventors, that, you know, we're sacrificing maybe something that could be, you know, 20 years from now for today, and that's possibly the correct decision.
Yeah, often that gets pulled out and ends up coming apart once you do those informed consents with all the researchers and you explain to them. I think Bryce mentioned earlier just the time sink, but sometimes that extra education can help. It's just if you have the bandwidth to be able to do that each time, you know, sit down with the researchers, explain, here are the consequences of that. As soon as you have to get their signature saying, hey, we have no obligation to file a patent application on this, and you know, in the future, just so that you know that, often they ask more questions. Well, what if I want to, you know, create a startup? And that's come up before. It's like, well, no, I mean, it'd be very challenging for you to do so. And that can sometimes sway the researchers' minds from thinking, oh, this maybe isn't such a good thing for me right now. Well, so that's all of the questions as well. And I thought we could wrap up here. I want to thank my panelists for being willing to share these conversations, be part of the conversation. I think there might be a part 2 to this where we talk about a little bit more detail on a couple ideas that we're thinking about, which might be useful. But thanks to everyone, and for everyone that called in as well. Thanks for listening in.